Hi, I'm Perry Atkinson, General Manager here at theDove. Hey, check out our other videos and check out our website at theDove.us. Well, today is a very special day here on Focus Today. We have a very special guest, Irving Roth, with us today, and I think you're going to find his story to be absolutely fascinating. And what I'm going to encourage you to do is be listening shortly. We'll be giving you an email address where you can email him to get a copy of his book and his memoirs, and we'll be giving you also a couple of websites that you can resource as well. And he's a Holocaust survivor, and from there the story it really unfolds. Irving, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure to be here.
And you've been traveling throughout Oregon.
Yes.
You sure you don't want to move here?
Actually, it's quite exciting. We did some traveling today, and the scenery is magnificent.
That's wonderful. Well, your story is magnificent. Now, you have capsulated your whole life in this memoir, right?
Yes.
And people can get that by emailing you. We'll give that address out in just a little bit, but fascinating story. Tell us your story. It begins in Czechoslovakia, and that's where you were born, right?
Yes.
What happened?
Well, Czechoslovakia being, it was, when I was born, it was a democracy. And of course, the war comes along and suddenly part of Czechoslovakia becomes Slovakia and becomes a fascist country which begins to persecute Jews, emulating totally what Germany has done. And so my life changes from living in a totally integrated society, integrated school with friends of every religious denomination, and suddenly I'm ostracized. I am not allowed to do certain things, and eventually, as so much of European Jewry, I wind up in a place called Auschwitz, subsequently in Buchenwald, and eventually, of course, 1945, liberated.
Wow. All right. So how old were you when things began to change?
When I was 10 years old. I was born in 1929, so 1939 really is the change that takes place, because Germany occupied Sudetenland in 1938 with the blessing of England and France and the rest of the world, with the promise of no war, no more land. Czechoslovakia can stay just the way it is. But of course, that does not happen. In 1939, in the spring, Germany occupies the Czech portion, and Slovakia becomes now a fascist country.
Wow. Well, those of us who've read about it but didn't live through it, how were Jews treated, including your family?
Very badly.
When did it begin?
It really began in 1939, almost immediately after the formation of Slovakia, with small little things like you can't go into the park because you're a Jew. You can't go to the beach because you're a Jew. And then it escalates into you can't own a fur coat because that's a luxury and because you're a Jew. And eventually I get thrown out of school because I'm a Jew. My father's business is taken away from him because he's a Jew. And of course, 1942 begins the actual murder of the Jews of Europe in a wholesale fashion by creating the death camps in Poland. And that's when things go down.
Wow. September 2nd, 1940, significant day for you. Tell us about it.
September 2nd, 1940 is significant because that's the day I'm thrown out of school. Very significant in that not only do I get thrown out of school, not only do all the Jewish teachers get fired on that day, but I go to the field where I play with my friends. I'm a very good soccer player. And the coach and my friends tell me I can no longer play because I'm a Jew. And that's extremely significant. It's betrayal.
I'm having a hard time digesting all of this. Was your family separated?
Yes. Eventually what happens, we managed to actually go from Slovakia and escape from Slovakia, where the Jews are being shipped to Auschwitz and other death camps. We managed to get into Hungary. In Hungary, I live with an aunt in a small village, and my brother. And my parents go into Budapest, to the capital, because my father needs a job. Mm-hmm. And that's where the separation comes from my parents. And eventually I wind up in Auschwitz with my brother, and we're together.
How did that happen? How did you end up there?
Well, what happened is that in 1944, in the spring, the Jews have been murdered en masse in the death camps all along. But in 1944, the only country where the Jews are still at home, as families, and the men are in the slave labor force, but as families, they're at home. Nazi Germany, together with the Hungarian Nazis, decide that there's this large number of Jews still alive. And therefore, the final solution to the Jewish question has not been accomplished. And so in 53 days, 437,000 Jews are taken from their home to a ghetto, to Auschwitz. And upon arrival, 90% of those that arrived are murdered.
You obviously feared for your life.
Yes.
How did you get through this?
By luck, being in the right place at the right time, and I think providence.
Sure, of course. I might want to mention to our viewers and listeners here that Mr. Roth is the director of the Holocaust Resource Center, and tell us about that organization.
It's a Holocaust Resource Center, and our primary purpose is to educate young and old on what actually took place. And we also discuss how it relates to today, because today the Jewish people in the world are still in trouble.
Yeah.
There's anti-Semitism certainly in Europe, and there's of course the other piece, which 6 million Jews live in a place called Israel, and they are being not only harassed, but they're threatened with annihilation. So we discuss all that.
I want to come to that a little bit, because anti-Semitism all over the world seems to be on the increase again, and how you feel about that. But tell us about Auschwitz. What was it like in there?
Well, Auschwitz, really there were 3 camps in Auschwitz, 1, 2, and 3. Auschwitz 1 was a slave labor camp. Auschwitz 2 was the death camp. That's where the actual annihilation took place. 1.1 million people were murdered in Auschwitz of the period of time of its existence. All Jews arrived in Auschwitz II. As you got off the train, these cattle cars, there was a selection, when 90% in general went immediately into the gas chamber. A small percentage was selected to live. I was one of those who was selected to live, as was my brother.
And how old were you at this time?
14.
14, and your brother was how old?
17.
Okay.
And as you're standing in line and you don't know where you really are, because all you see is guards all over the place telling you what to do, and you see, because we arrived there in the evening, and what I saw were flames coming out of chimneys. And so you can imagine being 14 years old, arriving someplace where you see all this. It's kind of scary. But eventually we were allowed to go and go to the bathroom. And eventually we were standing in formation, and we were tattooed. Each one of us who was lucky enough to be selected to work was tattooed, to make sure we understand that we are no different than cattle. We are branded. And from there, eventually I wound up working with horses, draining swamps and plowing the fields around Auschwitz.
Were you beaten?
Yes, on a few occasions.
What was the food like?
The food consisted in Auschwitz, which was very regular, I might point out. In the morning, you get a black concoction. Usually I call it coffee, but it's not really coffee. And it sometimes had some sugar substitute in it. At noon, we would get some soup, and at night, some bread.
And that's it?
That's it. So one is always hungry.
Sure.
Particularly here I am. I turned 15 years old. I'm a growing boy, always hungry. Because I worked with horses, before the actual labor in the field took place, we had to take care of the horses, which meant you had to get up an hour and a half earlier than anybody else. Get the horses from the field, clean them, feed them, give them water. And so the day was long. So I'm always hungry and I'm always tired.
Yeah.
But there's one other thing in Auschwitz, and that is the fact that on occasion, at night we would come back, and rather than being allowed to go into our building and get a piece of bread, wash up, and go to sleep, we would be marched to take a shower. Which in many ways was wonderful, except for the fact that here you are naked walking into the shower. On occasion there'd be a doctor in uniform look at you naked and determine if you should continue to live. A selection. So life and death was determined by simply passing past this doctor and he looking at you for an instant of time. Life and death.
So you could be working alongside somebody one day and they'd be gone the next.
That's correct.
How did you process that in your mind? How did you stay clear thinking?
I wanted to live. I always wanted to live. And so I did everything I could, having you might call it a positive attitude in a way. But the most important thing was never to give up. Under no conditions. The moment you said, this is impossible, I can't go on, and stop and say, I'm not going to eat my food, I'm not going to take care of myself, that was the end.
Was part of your were you a hard worker, so therefore they kept you, or did that make a difference?
Sometimes it did make a difference, sometimes it didn't. So I worked here, and of course the Russian army was approaching Auschwitz in January of 1945. And so they marched us out on a death march. And there too, the whole issue is, do you march, it's cold, you're tired, do you keep marching under guard, or do you give up? Many people gave up.
I want to take a break. I want to come back. I want to ask you how your faith played a part of your sustaining life, okay? All right, we'll be right back with Irving Roth in just a moment. Okay, we're back with our very special guest today, Irving Roth, and he is the director of the Holocaust Resource Center. I want to give you a couple of websites and an email, and you may want to jot these down and certainly take advantage of them. AdoptSurvivor.org is one of them, adoptasurvivor.org. You can go to temple-judea.com, and you can get his book, his memoir book. It just kind of summarizes everything that we're talking about here today in detail, and that's Irving, I-R-V-I-N-G, .Roth, 1, the number 1, at verizon.net. And if you didn't get any of that, you get a hold of us here at the Dove and we'll share it with you. Irving, this is, your story is just remarkable. Where did you turn to God in all this?
Well, God was always part of my life. I was brought up in a observant Jewish family, and God and I were partners. I always look at that as man and God are partners in this creation called our wonderful world. God did not design Auschwitz. God did not build it. Man did. Man was given a free choice, free will. Some chose evil. Unfortunately, millions of people listen to that choice and put them into power.
Wow, I got to process that statement. Did you witness people dying? I mean,
Sure.
Did you actually see the gas chambers?
Yeah. Well, not the gas chambers, because of course once you were in the gas chamber it was a closed area.
Yeah.
But during, after as the Russian army approached, we were on a death march. And if you slowed down, you were shot. And that, of course, I witnessed. Already on the first day, there were people who could no longer march because we were emaciated, we were cold and hungry, whereas the guards who were marching with us marched for 2 hours, and for 4 hours they rode on a horse and wagon or in a car or in a truck, whereas we continued to march. So you got very tired, and some people slowed down and they were shot.
Did you ever think the war would end?
Yes.
What gave you that hope?
By the time 1944 came along, the American army already occupied all of Italy. The Russian army was already in Poland. The bombing of Germany was taking place day and night. There was no question in my mind.
Did you know that? Did you get that information?
Yes.
So that was snuck into you?
Well, it's interesting. How did it sneak in?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things we did, in addition to working in the fields, on Sunday afternoons, we cleaned the barracks or the dwelling places of the Nazi guards.
Oh.
And to do that, of course, you clean up the place, and not only clean it up, you take all the garbage. Part of the garbage is the newspaper. So we read the German newspaper.
Wow.
And when you read one week that we reestablished the front on the eastern end of Warsaw, and a week later on the western end of Warsaw, well, you knew that Warsaw has fallen. And so you read, even though it was a Nazi newspaper, there were also a lot of rumor mills that went around. I suspect there may have been even a radio of some sort. But I was convinced that the war is going to end. I was convinced that Germany and its allies are going to lose the war. The objective is to stay alive.
All right. Tell us about the day you got out.
The day that I was liberated
Yes.
was April 11th, 1945.
I'm going to write that down. April 11th.
1945.
Wow.
But let me begin with
This April 11th, I'm going to be praying for you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Let me begin with April 10th.
Okay.
April 10th, starting really in the beginning of April, they started because the American army was getting close to Buchenwald, where I was at the time in the camp. And they started the death marches again. And I kept hiding.
Wow.
And I managed to do that. On April 10th, I'm hiding under a building in a crawl space. Unfortunately for me, one of the guards has a dog. Finds me. Marches me out with some other young people to the gate of Buchenwald. The guards are forming on both sides, ready to be marched out. I don't know how long I can march because I can hardly drag myself. While we're standing there, suddenly the siren goes off. Air raid. American airplanes are bombing the city of Weimar, which is some 7 kilometers away. They're circling around Buchenwald, looking what's going on. And of course, they wait because they don't want to be killed by some bombs. But on that day, the air raid lasted all day long, and I survived.
And then
April 11.
Yeah.
By 11 o'clock, every single guard in uniform disappeared. And 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 American soldiers walked into our barracks. One was black and one was white. 2 young, healthy soldiers who have seen battle and death. They walked into our barracks, and in my barracks there were children, 16-year-olds, 15-year-olds, skeletons shuffling along. These 2 guys looked at us and broke down.
I guess so.
But within maybe a few minutes, took everything out of their pockets, food-wise they had, K-rations and whatever, left, and 2 hours later, a jeep comes along with vats of food.
Wow.
And fed us.
And you were let go.
Well, it took about a month. Remember, the war was still going on.
Right.
The war wasn't over till the end of May, 8th of May.
Right.
So
that's amazing. Irving, your life's passion is to not only share this piece of history so that we don't forget it, but perhaps most importantly that we don't repeat it.
absolutely.
However, the anti-Semitism around the world is alarming, and even more so in America. I can't believe what we're seeing and sensing, and even with our current administration. What's that do to you inside?
It really does, to say the least, not just bother me, but it's scary. that the whole world has not changed, because anti-Semitism was what fueled the Holocaust. Today, the Jew is demonized again. The Jewish people are doing evil things. Listen to the radio. Listen, watch TV. Look at the newspaper. Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, is now called an apartheid state. A place where a Muslim who Israel supposedly is persecuting. If you look at the University of Haifa, 20% of the student population is Muslim. How can you possibly talk of apartheid when you have 20% of and the Muslim population of Israel is about 18%? How can you say that? But it doesn't matter, the whole world says it. The news media says it. Reporters say it. Here is Israel, it's 2014, and day after day, in the spring and early summer of 2014, Hamas is lobbing rockets into Israel.
Right.
They abduct 3 Jewish young men, murder them. Israel has to do something. Israel has to stop this. So they try and stop it. Now the Palestinian Authority is taking Israel to the International Court for war crimes. Right. This is pure, unadulterated fiction. Fiction, which people buy into.
As you know, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is due in the States in about a week and a half to give a speech that he's already being criticized for. Some don't want him to come. Even some people in Israel don't want him to come because it is the election cycle there.
Right.
But it may be, it just may be, the most important speech on world affairs that the world's ever heard. He may put in position just how serious all this is.
The job of a prime minister of a country is to make sure that his country is defended. Iran, whether we like it or not, will build a bomb, a nuclear bomb, many nuclear bombs. Iran has very clearly stated it will annihilate the state of Israel, which I consider to be preparation for another Holocaust. How can you sit there in Jerusalem and say, well, people are talking about many interesting stuff in the world, making peace, keeping a promise by Iran that, oh no, they're not interested in doing that. Well, I'm very cognizant of what people say, but I remember when in 1938 September, Adolf Hitler signed a piece of paper saying that he has absolutely no intention of starting a war or any other aspect of Czechoslovakia except Sudetenland. The world was euphoric. Peace in our time, said the Prime Minister of England as he got off the plane in Heathrow. Mm-hmm. But in the spring of 1939, 6 months later, the German army occupied half of Czechoslovakia. So much for promises. Mm-hmm. The existence of Israel is threatened by Iran on a continuous basis. They're in the process of enriching uranium. How do you sit back and do nothing?
Let me take another break. Can I have you for one more?
Sure.
Okay.
As long as you want.
Here's what I want to ask you when I come back. We learned today that our country is not sharing intelligence on Iran with Israel. And I'd like for you to respond to that. We'll be right back with Irving Roth in just a moment. Okay, we're back with Irving Roth, and a just fascinating story to say the least. He is the director of Holocaust Resource Center. He's got a book of his memoirs. He's a Holocaust survivor from Auschwitz. I want to give you a couple of websites here, and I hope that you will jot them down and take advantage of them. Adoptasurvivor.org. I want you to explain that in just a moment. Adoptasurvivor.org. The other one is temple-then-judea.com. And if you'd like to get a copy of his book, you can email him, and he'll make that arrangements with you. Irving.Roth, R-O-T-H, the number 1, at verizon.net. Okay, as we were going into the break, Irving, the news is, I was pretty angry when I read this morning, and I've calmed down since, but it looks like that the current administration of the United States is not going to share with Israel, our only ally in the Middle East, intelligence on Iran as they go into these so-called negotiations. How do you respond to that?
This is a travesty. Israel's life depends upon security. How do you make sure that you can defend yourself if your enemy, if your sworn enemy, who has promised to destroy you, is in the process of developing nuclear bombs? Yeah, I know, they promised not to do that.
Mm-hmm.
There should be absolutely no light between what America does and Israel knows. There should be a continuous, constant consultation, because the first place that nuclear bombs will be used by Iran will be Israel.
Mm-hmm.
How do you not talk about it? How do you not share information? It's scary. It's scary.
Do you believe America's turning its back on Israel, or the administration's turning its back on Israel?
Well, I believe that America does not turning its back on Israel. I think it's a certain amount of misguidance, a certain amount of hopefulness, euphoria, naivete.
Wow.
I think that is what the problem is. It's the desire to have peace. It's the desire to keep the world going. But I think it's naive to think that there are people who have proven themselves to be liars.
Mm-hmm.
They are supporting all of terrorism. They are the major supporter of terrorism in the world today. How do I equate that with making a deal with them? Yes, I think it's important to try and do that. But I believe it's, Teddy Roosevelt said, verify, verify, verify.
How can Christians help?
I think Christians are helping. And I've been very fortunate to be involved with a group of Christians, Christians United for Israel, whose single agenda is the safety, the security of Israel. That's the agenda. And they do it politically, they do it financially. When I started working with WWII, there was less than 750,000 members. Today there are 2.1 million. Wow. Christians who are supporting the idea that Israel needs to exist as a state and has the right to exist. And that's the hope. If there is one request I have of everyone in America, join WWII. Go from the 2.1 million to 21 million to 210 million, making sure that Israel as a state exists. After all, why does the Czech Republic exist? What right do they have to exist? What right does France have to exist? Because they're a set of people. The Jews have been living in that place for 3,000 years.
Right.
Yes, they were chased out.
Right.
But there's always Jews living in this land where they created a country, a kingdom, a culture. And for 2,000 years, they prayed for the return to Jerusalem every single day, 3 times. And finally, they're back. Why should we not say they have the right to exist? And one of the problems happens to be also, I guess, in the last few days. We in America want to fight terrorism. Terrorism is terrorism. It doesn't matter against whom. Why is terrorism against Israel okay? Why is terrorism in Paris against the newspaper not okay? But terrorism against the Jewish store is okay. Terrorism is terrorism. Here is a state that is the major implementer of terrorism, but that's okay, because it's against Israel. This is bizarre. This is doublethink. This is George Orwell, his book on 1984.
We watched 21 Coptic Christians get marched out and beheaded. The next day, 45 people put in a cage and burned to death. They didn't want to call them Christians, they just wanted to call them Egyptian citizens. At the end of the day, do you believe this is a religious war?
In its own way, it is. And of course, we try to make very fine distinction, not saying it's an Islamic problem. Well, Islam has many pieces to it. People interpret Islam, just like people interpret Christianity, Judaism, and so on. Islam right now has one part which are ordinary garden variety murderers, called ISIS or ISIL, beheading people. But the other people in Islam, if they disagree, they must disagree fully. Turkey cannot stand here and say it's okay to terrorize the Jews, but it's not okay to terrorize somebody else. They need to be united with us, with the whole world, saying terrorism on everyone is immoral, period.
What we don't seem to be getting here, Irving, is that your generation lived through what we have a hard time fathoming, the Holocaust. Now you're seeing it repeated in a modern way. But the brutal murdering of people, no matter what their persuasion is being tolerated.
Yes.
I can't get my brain around that. We're watching the Holocaust play out again on worldwide television, and we're excusing it. What's that do to you?
One of the expression is used sometimes that the Jews are the canaries of the world.
In the mind.
Now, canaries were used in mines, of course, because they can get methane. The moment the slightest amount of methane is there, they die, and therefore it's time to get out of there. What happens to the Jews today will happen to the rest of the world tomorrow. I think the basic example is in Paris and in Denmark. The world must recognize the fact that the terrorism and the idea of destroying the Jewish people is just the first step. People hate Israel, people hate democracy, people hate freedom. Their objective is the same. Wow. We must recognize that, and I think we must fight it. Straightforward.
Okay, so what do you want us to do?
I want everyone, in a strange way, I want everyone in America to join Kufa, all the Christians. And I would like all the Muslims to join an organization similar to it, saying murder anywhere is immoral. We cannot allow murder to become a political tool. And I think we have allowed murder to become a political tool because you're oppressing me, therefore I have the right to murder you. I don't have enough to eat, therefore I can murder you. I don't have a good job, therefore I can allow. No. Murder must not become a political tool. It has become so, and we are not fighting it strongly enough and resolutely enough.
You're an inspiration.
Thank you, sir.
And let me say to our viewers and listeners again, adoptasurvivor.org is one of the websites. Temple-Judea.com is one of the other websites. And the name of your memoirs here?
Yes.
And what is it here? Okay. This is the, I'll hold it up to the camera, you can see it there. And if you'd like to get a copy of his memoirs, you can email him, and that email address is, where did I have it here, just a moment. Oh, there it is, Irving.Roth, the number 1, at Verizon.net. You're heading back to New York, that's where you live?
On Tuesday.
Okay, and when will you be back on the West Coast?
Well, probably in May.
You have an open invitation here anytime.
Well, thank you very much.
Blessings
Pleasure.
on you. Blessings.